Well, thank you very much, Carl. Thank you very much, Peter, for organizing teams. Carl, for the dedication to start the to redo the conference virtually in spite of the challenges that we're all facing. And I am pleased to say that I am speaking live from my office in Vienna. So, but not Vienna, Austria, unfortunately. It's in Vienna, Virginia. This is a town outside of Washington, D.C., where I live. And we are about 15 miles away from the center of Washington, D.C. And it's a town that was created about 150 years ago. And most people in the general DC area just know it as the end of a metro subway line. A little background about me. I'm the president and founder of FMS, designer of all of our products related to Microsoft Access, and have developed quite a large number of applications, both in Access, SQL Server, and some .NET. I've been an Access MVP for a while. I've served on a variety of different boards. I'm educated actually as a physical oceanographer, but that was a different lifetime away.
Luke, quick interruption.
Sure.
You have a little Teams window at the bottom right of your screen, which is overlapping. Can you move that away?
Okay, I will move that away. There. Is that better?
Excellent, thank you.
Okay. So FMS has been around for 33 years, and we have a variety of products that we've created for Microsoft Access. 12 of them. Probably our most famous is our Total Access Analyzer, which does database documentation. We have a database comparison product, Total Access Detective, Total Access Emailer does emailing, and a variety of other products that help you throughout the whole development lifecycle and administration. So those are all available on our website if you want more. We have another product in this called Sentinel Visualizer, which does data visualization, looks at hidden relationships among people, places, and events, not related to this, but it's a significant part of our business. And we have a consulting team that provides custom solutions on .NET, SQL Server, Azure, Access, and Office. But the presentation I'm giving today is specifically regarding remote access, running access or running all Windows applications across machines and through servers and potentially even in the cloud. And so I will go through the steps with regards to the different levels that can entail, starting from the most basic of remote desktop, being able to run another machine from another location, remote app, which is running one application instead of the whole desktop, configuring a hosting server to be able to support multiple remote desktop or remote app users, and how to connect via remote desktop or remote app, installing Office in a remote server to be able to support that, and then creating remote app RDP files that will allow individual users to run those applications from another machine. So at the most basic level, and I think a lot of people are using this, especially with the COVID-19 situation where people are off-site, is remote desktop. And that's a built-in feature in Windows, or at least the business versions of Windows, so that you can run a PC from another PC without having to be there. This is commonly used in servers, virtual machines, Hyper-Vs and such like that on a machine or from another machine, right? And so the host can be a server or a standard version of Windows, and the caller side, the local machine, can invoke it. So the advantage of that is that a user can run programs installed on the host without having it installed on their local machine. Also allows the manager of that to be able to define what the user can see or run on that host machine. Remote desktop, which is available in Windows, is nice because it handles local printers and the clipboard. So the things that you use in the clipboard stay within your environment, so you can copy and paste things between the remote host machine desktop to your local PC, or even between different remote desktops. And if you need to print something, it prints where you're located, what your machine is connected to, and not necessarily the machine where the printer where the host is. It doesn't require installing any programs on the local PC. Matter of fact, the local PC doesn't even have to be a PC. It could be a Mac or another device that can connect to the host. If the host is on the network, it can use all the network resources and take advantage of all the performance benefits of that you can't from a remote location. So if you were at home and you're trying to connect to an Access database over an internet line, that's a different kind of experience than if you were just remoting to a PC that was sitting on your office desktop that's connected directly, hardwired on the network to the file server that provides you with the data. The other thing is, if the host is a virtual machine, Hyper-V, for instance, it can easily be duplicated and restored with checkpoints and shared among multiple people. And again, the remote PC can connect to multiple host PCs at one time. So that's the baseline. Now, in order to be able to support this with Access applications, we want to make sure that the Access application already works, right? I mean, you need to make sure the application works in the environment that you want to deploy it in before we consider the remote issues. So at the most basic level, if we have a multi-user application on a desktop just inside your organization before you even consider remote, it needs to work properly before you remote to it. So, there are lots of different architectures for Access solutions, and it can include just a single database. It can be a split database where you have a front end, back end, or a shared back end. Access ACCDB or MDB format database is sitting on a file server that multiple users connect to and modify, while the front end database is local on each user's PC. Or other architectures where the back-end database is not an Access database, but a SQL Server, could be upsized from Access, or it could be connected to other platforms, Oracle, DB2, whatever. So those are the different kinds of applications that people have. So if the front-end application is being distributed to each desktop, we want to make sure that when we do this in where we're going to go further in a shared environment, where we're going to have multiple users on the same machine, that the application is designed so that it's not expecting a fixed folder name, like on the C drive. And when we go into a shared environment, we're going to need to put front-end databases into each user's profile folder. So if you have an application that expects to be sitting in the C:"my app folder, that's not going to work. And so you'll need to make that adjustment. But once the application is working properly, then we have the potential of running either in a remote desktop or in a remote app solution. So a remote app is a little different from a remote desktop. A remote desktop, so let me just switch over. So this is an example of a remote desktop. I have connected in to a server, and it looks like my Windows environment, and I can go anywhere and run the programs that are available there. A remote app is a different experience you can give users, which is similar to remote desktop in the sense that nothing is installed on the user's machine and all of the work is being done by the back-end remote host machine. But you restrict the use so that the user only runs one application, in this case, an Access application, right? And so they can't run Windows, they can't run File Explorer, they can't go and delete all your files or do other things that would impact other programs. We're going to restrict it to just the application. This is basically a restricted version of remote desktop, but it gives people an experience that is more like an application. So I'll just show how that's done. Let me see how I do it. We'll go into detail about this. I double click on this. I have a user, and I just show this to be an example for this presentation, because usually I would do remember me, and this wouldn't be a prompt each time. But when I run this, This is set up so that it will load an Access application and launch it. And it looks like, just log in this way, I mean, it's just Northwind, but it looks like a Access application on my desktop, but this version of Access is not on my desktop. This database is not sitting on my PC. It's sitting in a remote app on the server, and I just get to run it here. From a user perspective, I never installed Access. I never installed this application. I don't know where it is, and it just shows up in my taskbar as an application that looks like it's running on its own. But it's, in fact, running completely in another environment, and I can say current db.name, and it will show that it got put into the username as Vienna in its profile folder. So we'll get back to that later. Let's just exit out of that remote desktop for now. But that's the remote app, okay? So it gives a very seamless and positive user experience because it looks like they just launched a program that's running on their PC when in fact everything is happening on the server side. So that's where we want to get to, right? And so for many situations when people say, oh, I wish Access could be on the web, or I wish I could get to it on the internet, a whole class of situations are such that when people say that, they don't necessarily mean they want an HTML browser-based version of Access. They just want to be able to run their Access application, right? And so by being able to use Remote App to host an Access application, and of course it can host any Windows applications. People have legacy VB6 apps. It could be an Excel spreadsheet. It could be a .NET WinForms app. All of those things can be hosted through a remote app experience to allow people who can reach that via the internet, via VPN, or via some secure connection from their remote site to the host site, the ability to run that without having to install anything on their machine, which is often a roadblock or a hassle with Access applications, especially when different versions of Access are released, and maybe older versions of Access applications haven't been tested on the new platform. So you can host and control that when you do it all from the back end host server. So remote app, remote desktop, they're part of Windows Server ever since Windows Server 2008 R2. It's part of terminal services. And the idea is that your server would be able to host multiple sessions, really a quote, unlimited number of sessions governed by hardware constraints, so that each user can run their own instance of Access with their Access database all on that same machine. You just install it once and make sure it gets distributed properly to each of the people. So the advantage of a remote app deployment is that you don't need to install Access on each user's machine. You don't need to make sure that the right service packs are maintained and so on. Much more maintainable, centralized control of Windows and Access versions. Easier to debug. If you have a crash, you can very easily go to the remote site and experience what a user experienced exactly without having to go to their machine. It supports non-Windows users who want to connect to it, and it can support all internal Windows applications, right? Now, some of the limitations of a remote app deployment is that the number of concurrent users is limited by the server hardware, right? So the only thing that matters is concurrent users, not the total number of users, because if people aren't connected to it, who cares? But the concurrent users is going to be limited by how much hardware you have and what people do in the application, right? So it's hard to say, oh, we can support 10 apps or 10 users at a time or 50 users at a time. That very much depends on what users are doing in the application that they would be running. But a remote app hosting environment is not as scalable as a as a website, right? A website, HTML pages or .NET or Java or whatever, can support, if the host is able to do it, thousands of users at one time. And it's not really creating a different session or running a different version of Windows or the Access application in that environment. But for a lot of Access applications, right? Access applications are really ideal for maybe, 100 or fewer users at one time on a back-end Access database, much larger if the front-end database, the back-end database is SQL Server, right? It's really kind of unlimited at that point. SQL Server being the database provider in that case, but the front end from a remote app or from the Windows Server perspective can support quite a lot that are connected to that, right? And we would expect a couple gigabytes at least for each user, just like you would expect a basic Windows application. But Windows Server is smart enough to share resources across the different sessions that are run. So how do we implement a remote app experience with Access? Well, we're going to start with the idea that the application we're going to deploy is a multi-user application. Obviously, if it was just a single user database, that's simpler. But just best practices, even if it is single, you want to have a split database with the database separate from the front end Access application, right, with the queries, forms, reports, and so on, linked through linked tables to the backend database, right? And the backend database need to determine where it's going to be. It can be on the host machine, so potentially it could be, say, on the C drive of the server. And if you're going to do that, you need to have a backup plan and some administration to make sure that that database is compacted inside that VM machine or virtual machine. We tend not to want to store real data inside virtual machines. You could separately have it just like you would normally have traditionally. The backend database, where in this case we're talking Access, is sitting on a file share somewhere on the network, right? And so just like before, your front-end database goes on each user's desktop, and then it connects to the back-end shared Access database. Or it could be a SQL Server database, in which case the SQL Server database could be hosted on a server, SQL Server on-premise or in the cloud. Again, same thing with the front-end database. And basically anything that Access supports could be supported in this environment, because what we're really focused on is making sure that the front-end database experience is what the user sees, and we as a developer need to make sure that the plumbing is properly configured so that it goes to the back-end data source. Right? And because we're going to host it on the server and we want every user to have their own front-end database, we can't put it in one folder because then everybody would collide. The usual protocol is to put it in the profiles of each user. So by default, Windows will open up a profiles folder that the user has read and write access to. So it'd be the username / my documents. You could create a subfolder in there, wherever you'd like to put your front-end database, that's where it would go. Now, when you configure your server, you must allow it to have remote access, remote connections to it. And this is the same for a remote desktop, whether it's on a local PC or on a server. If you want to be able to connect to it from another machine, you need to set the system properties, go to the remote tab, and make sure you check allow remote connections to it. And you can specify specific users if you want to do that, if you want to restrict it to specific people, and you can maintain the security that way. And then from the desktop side, from the user local side, when you want to connect to it, you would run remote desktop connection, specify the computer name, specify the username, and then ask for the credentials, right? So at the most basic level, I had, let's see, so that would be a remote desktop. I'm going to connect here. And then it allows me to specify the username. I can actually go into, a second, let me cancel this. Let me show the details here. and you could specify the name and have it save the credentials or prompt all the time. We don't like being prompted each time. And then you can control how it's displayed, the local resources of the printers and the clipboard, and then other topics that go with it. But in general, we're working here, and then we specify what we want. Then when we connect to it, it jumps over and then launches the remote desktop experience that we want. All right, so that's the remote desktop. That's basically one level before we get to the remote app. Okay, so I showed the options of how to set that. Allow save credentials is important. We want to be able to display the tab, and here you can specify how big you want the screen. You can have it fill your whole screen locally. It's just like maximizing the application, or you can make it a smaller size if you want it to open up inside its own window, at least when it launches. And then you can specify what local resources you want for printers and clipboards and so on. Okay, so what gets interesting is when we do the remote app part of it. So rather than letting people go in and hit the desktop and get the whole desktop, let's create a shortcut essentially so that we can distribute applications, our Access applications, to all the users. So when they click on it, the application runs. Right? And the application runs, people think it's running on their desktop, but it's really running on the back-end server. And we can manage that by using Windows Server. The example I'm going to show is on 2019, which is the latest version, but again, I mentioned anything after 2008 supports this. So you can have on a server, right, the difference between a server and a desktop version is a server can host multiple users connected to it at the same time, right? So before we go to the remote app level, we want to make sure that the remote desktop part works, and then we're taking a next step above that, which is to restrict them just to that application. We're going to install all the programs and files that we need on the host machines, and then we're going to run the programs there. Now, one of the tricky things when it comes to doing this is that how you install Office on this is different than the regular version of Office. So under terminal server, and I think that term is disappearing because it's turning more into the term remote desktop server, Office requires a different kind of key, a volume license key, or a license management process that needs to be configured a little bit differently, and I will show how to do that. Now, separate to that, if we don't need all of Office, if we don't need Excel, we don't need Word, whatever, we can actually do this with Access Runtime. Installing Access Runtime doesn't require installing all of Office, and of course, Access Runtime is free, so you don't have the hassles of doing the licensing. For this example, I'm going to show the more difficult challenge, which is running with a full-blown version of Access, or at least I wanted to be able to do that to show the examples of Access. But that may not be what you want in your deployed version anyway. So what do I mean by this? So if you attempt to install a version of Office on the machine that is the server, which is going to be your remote desktop, it can trigger an error like this. I know it may be a little hard to see. It says this copy of Microsoft Office cannot be used on a computer running terminal services. And that's what we need to have installed to be able to host all the remote desktop users. So it's to use Microsoft Office, you have to do this. This was a message from 2010. There are different messages for different versions. So the way we do this, I mean, Microsoft offers the information on how to do this, is we need to download an Office deployment tool. This is free. It comes from Microsoft, and it requires updating a configuration file to be able to specify this. So I will show, let's see, first of all, how am I going to show this? I will show how this works. So there is a web page that I pointed to there called Deploying Microsoft 365 Apps by Remote Desktop Services. So this is the web page, and I'll provide the slides. You'll have the link that provides the information on how to do that, along with the configuration file issues. And there's a link to configuring your server to support remote desktop, and that's what this page is. And then there's another link to download this file, which is this Office deployment tool, right? And it has explanations on how to do that. And so since I've already done that, I will show, let's see, no, I've got a different session, which is the administrator. So it has within it, when you install it, the Office deployment tool. Let me see this. I'll just do details. So when you install it, it installs 3 different XML files in addition to its setup file. And these XML files, if we edit it, let's just open it. There's one for the 32-bit version, there's one for the 64-bit version, and then there's one for the enterprise version that has what's there, what's needed, and then a section for property values that we need to update. And then the way to do it is to, once you're done with that, to rename it to configuration.xml and then call it with this setup program with the /download or /configure option. You actually can leave it in the original name, but then you'd have to pass it the name. It's looking for, by default, the configuration.xml. So the example of this, which I configured to do that, has the settings to be able to download and install the versions properly. So let's go back to that. I know that's a lot, but the details are written here and on those web pages. All right, so we basically need to put in something called the accept EULA line for the display level, which makes it so that it's not showing everything on the screen, and then shared computer licensing value equals 1. And in order to do this, you need to have the right licensing, and I can never keep track of licensing, or ask Microsoft specifically how that works. So assuming that you do that, then the other thing that's necessary on the server is configuring it to support remote desktop. And so you need to log into the server as administrator and update the roles and features of the server so that remote desktop services is turned on. And then when we do that, then these things will work. So let me just show that quickly. So this is under the, if you're familiar with managing servers, there's a server manager, and then there's an add roles and features dialog that steps you through this. And I have instructions on how to do that, but the key thing here is that we're going to select remote desktop services, right? And once we install that, then this server is going to be able to host multiple remote desktop sessions. Actually, in the documentation on that web page I referenced, it says to go under Tools, Terminal Services to configure this, but it's actually now been renamed under Remote Desktop Services. And so you actually have to set up a change in the Desktop Licensing Manager to be able to host this when you're dealing with full-blown versions of Office. So just be aware of that, and you can just step through that. These are all wizards that you go through. But just be aware, if you're looking for under the Tools menu, Terminal Services, it's not there. So configuration for XML. So if we're going to configure this, this was the example with 32. That part doesn't really matter. It's this part that we're going to add these 2 lines to be able to do that. And then when we do that, we can run that setup program. And you have to be an administrator, open up the command window, run setup.exe/download, and you can add the configuration.xml, the name of the XML file for it, or you can leave it blank if it's named configuration.xml. And this takes a while. It actually downloads all of the Office setup files in order to be able to do it. And it looks like your screen is frozen. It just takes, I mean, it may take over half an hour to get all those files, and it doesn't show any progress while that's going on. Once it comes down, then you run setup.exe/configure, and it will take care of basically installing it with the XML specification. So this is actually a two-step process. After that's installed, you can run it and verify that it's working and activate it. And then you'll be required to reboot this. This is on the server side. So once you have that going, then you will prepare that. Now it's basically ready to run your Access application. And of course, at that point, you could run your Access, because you have Access installed, you could run your Access application and make sure it's working. So the next step is to prepare it for a remote app, right? So in order to do this, you need to be an administrator. Make sure the right version of Access is installed, or runtime, whatever it is that you need there. Interactively test, verify you can run it, and make sure your connections to the network, link tables, and things like that work. A critical thing here is to make sure that you link to tables, if you're doing links, using the server names and not mapped drives. So that may be slightly different in the sense that maybe you're deploying applications where you link to tables on the K drive or M drive or something like that, and that works perfectly fine on each user's desktop. But in a remote server environment, each user may be running their instance, essentially, of Windows Server without any of their drives mapped. So we want to make sure that our Access front-end database can work with any such environment. Right? So the other thing that you need to make sure on the host server is to make sure that wherever you deploy your Access application, that it is trusted, right? And so this shouldn't be an issue because it's your machine, it's your server. So, if you made C:/users a trusted location on that server at the machine level, then all the users will be able to run Access applications in their profile folders, right? And this can be done in regedit, or it depends on, you can also do it from the front end, from the Access application if you're running as administrator, and it will set it up for the whole machine. Right? And so then you just run whatever you use to launch your application, make sure that's working. Now, remote app and configuring a remote app RDP file is a nightmare if you want to craft it yourself step by step. Fortunately, there's a free tool that people use called Remote App Tool from Kim Knight that's available for download, and essentially steps through the process of creating a remote desktop shortcut link. That configures it both on the server side and then gives people outside the server a shortcut to use it, right? And so it allows you, so an RDP file is essentially a shortcut. And when that's shared with other people, that RDP file contains information about what server it's on and what application or files, command lines essentially, need to be run in order to launch its application, right? And so here's an example of, it's a very simple program, a screen of what's going on. There's a path, which is the name of Access. So we're going to run Access, and then we're going to run a file that goes before it. And there are things that we would do around that. Now, this is the most basic, where I'm showing it's running C:/Northwind. That's not deployed to each user's profile folder, but that's just an example of you could create an RDP file that would just run that database through a very simple thing like this. And of course, that would be the simplest step forward until we get to a more multi-user type environment. So I can flip over to see that. Wait a second, not this one, but this one. So let me minimize this. And this is the remote app tool that you can download to do it. And so the example here is I can take an this is what I was showing in terms of, in this case, I'm just running a file that's sitting on the network. I'm just running it from the PC. So this is a very simple example of doing this remote desktop. And then when I'm done creating it here, I can create a client connection, which is creating an RDP file. I can save that, distribute that, and then when people launch that, it will do what this says, which is, hey, run Access on this machine, and in the command line, launch Access with this database that's on the server. And the user doesn't need to know anything about where Access is installed, what version of Access is installed, or where these files are. It's completely hidden from them. And the nice thing is you can deploy this RDP file shortcut, which points to this remote app definition on the server, and then you can change it on the server later if you need a different version of Access, a different front-end database, whatever it is, without having to update the user's shortcuts. Okay, so that's that. So it's used to manage all of the remote desktop and remote app sessions that you would have on the machine. And of course, this isn't restricted just to Access apps. It could be any kind of Windows application that you want to install on the server so that other people can run it without having to install it on their desktop. Now, the nice thing about this is that Windows Server is smart. You can actually support multiple applications for each user in a single connection. So instead of having, so let's take a step back. When you do a remote desktop session or when you run an app, what's really happening is when the first time you do it, the user essentially gets a private copy of their version of Windows. It's running a version of Access or whatever the application is. And so that takes a certain number of resources. If you gave them a second application, another remote app hyperlink shortcut to click, then if you don't control this, they could run a completely separate session of Windows and Access and consume those resources totally independent and inefficiently. So you're allowed to do that, and by default, that's the way remote desktop and remote app works. But there's a setting that you can change on the server so that you each user, or I should say each person, each PC, if it launches multiple remote apps, would share the same connection, right? So that just reduces the resources that your server consumes so you can support multiple users on it. Okay, and the way that you would do that is from the host, it's a group policy setting, and under configurations, you would change the connections thing so that there's an option here called restrict remote desktop services, and we would change that to limit people to a single remote instance. Just so you know, there's another configuration item here called limit number of connections, and by default that's not configured, and it will allow an unlimited number of users to try to connect to the server. You can, if you want to, change that and limit it to a fixed number. So if you say, oh, I don't want more than 10 users simultaneously on this, that's a way to configure that as well. So if you want to prevent users from running it, you set that option and you set it to enabled, and then it will restrict each user to essentially one remote desktop session, even though they have multiple apps running at one time. Okay, so that's an efficient use of resources. Now, taking it to the next level is if we have this on remote desktop, remote server environment, that can also be virtualized and moved into the cloud. So Azure supports virtual machines. And you can have a virtual machine that would be your host for all these remote desktop and remote app solutions. Now, it's a little tricky compared to a server that may be hosted on your on-premise network, because if you're using back-end databases that are also on your network, putting that into the Azure cloud isn't going to work, because the Azure cloud isn't going to communicate or link to your Access database in your network. But if you moved everything up there, that is something that can be done. And of course, if the back-end database is in SQL Server, and especially if it's in SQL Azure, then this would seem like a natural place to do this, right? And if you do that, then just keep in mind that you do want to have your virtual machine on Azure in the same data center as your SQL Azure servers where you're hosting your SQL Server database, right? But if you can configure it so that you have the backend database, then you'll be able to create essentially the same experience doing remote, except now it's completely in the cloud, and then you would have to deal with the security around that. I didn't have enough time in this session to go into that, but I do provide a hyperlink to be able to get Microsoft's documentation on how to set that up in the Azure environment. For more remote app resources, you can visit our website. We have a paper there on dealing with some terminal services. It's actually a little bit older than what I'm presenting here in this paper, this presentation, so I will update that in the near future. We also have a Total Access Startup program, which is what we use to launch our Access application and copy over the front-end database to each user's machine. It has a profiles option so that it will automatically take care of that. So that's helpful. We also have a lot of resources on our website. If you haven't visited before, we have a whole bunch of Microsoft Access developer papers. There's a whole center for papers related to queries, and then SQL Server upsizing. So with that, I have some social media stuff. So if you want to follow us, we have blogs, our Facebook page, Twitter. We have email newsletters. You can sign up for that, and different things that we've done on news presentations. So with that, I'll just wrap up. Once again, thank you, Carl, for organizing and leading this conference. It's been a pleasure to participate, both in person in past years and this time virtually. Peter, thank you for managing the Teams hosting, and I hope this was helpful. Thank you very much.
Very nice, Luke. I think it was very interesting.
Yeah.
It's a very complicated technical matter, of course. A lot of details. I have some questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Okay. There weren't all too many because you had a lot of details already in. When you restrict to a single application, is the LDB file considered part of the application? I think that was for remote apps. What?
Okay, so the application is being restricted just to the front end. So it's the access application, not the what access does behind the scenes.
Another question. Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what's happening with the LDB. The LDB is actually probably on the file server that all the people are hitting. Yeah.
Yes.
Another question would be how much RAM to support 200 users? So is it a memory issue? Do you need much memory?
So the question is basically how much RAM do you need by user?
Well, that comes down to, well, how much RAM does your application use for one user, right? So it depends what the application is and what people are doing on it. And that's a common question of, well, if I run a query or run a report that takes half an hour or an hour to run, that's going to consume a lot of resources. It's very different from somebody who's just doing data entry, looking at one screen, how fast can they type, or people who are just viewing data, they're not editing data. So the nice thing is Windows Server does offer lots of tools to be able to monitor resource usage. And it also is efficient in allocating resources to people who use it. So there really isn't a fixed number that I would go by. I mean, I think we've used some general rules of we want to have at least 2 gigabytes per concurrent user as kind of a guideline. But so much depends on what they're doing at that time, right? So if everybody's using it and they just open up the app and they're not doing anything, well, you can support a lot of people doing that.
Can I add to that, just in case it's helpful? We've got a lot of users, not in remote apps, certainly, but remote desktop, and they're hitting Access pretty well all day. And I've always been quite surprised at how many they can. I don't know the full details of the server. I know they're quite heavily, they've got a lot of RAM, they've got a lot of resources. But when it's when you compare using the Access database and just using it as normal users, it's an app, with like web browsing kills the system, whereas it's almost as if you can have as many of the Access apps going as you like, and it won't be a problem. It's some of the other stuff that hurts the resources. I hope that helps.
Mike Freed just commented, because he's very, very experienced user when it comes to Citrix and remote desktop and so on, and he mentioned 2 GB per user is okay.
Yeah.
Another question would be from Steve Chappell. Can't install Access 365 on the server. Is that correct? Have to use perpetual 2019 or whatever.
Well, so there are a couple issues there. I mean, if you want to deploy with Access runtime, then there isn't a licensing issue. There's no licensing cost. But I showed the example of how you would install the Office 365 or Office whatever, it really doesn't matter what version, that is compatible or licensed properly with the terminal server remote desktop requirements.
So it's just a licensing problem.
It's totally a licensing issue. The bits don't change.
Another question from Alejandro Javaria. What is the best scripted automatic way of deploying a front end to a user's profile on a remote machine? Perhaps scripted to happen on log on, so every time they open it, they're getting the latest update.
Right. I mean, I showed the example. I mean, we use our Total Access startup product. That's a commercial product that does the deployment, that has a profile option. But I guess if you wrote some sort of simple program that would deploy to the front end desktop, I mean, this is the same whether you're doing it in remote desktop or in a multi-user environment across a network.
So Alejandro, go for Luke's tool.
This is a technical discussion, wasn't meant to be a commercial.
No, very nice technical. Yes, another point, you will definitely share your slide deck, will you?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Because there was a lot of things, a lot of links.
Yep.
For example, the remote app tool that looked very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Because I already had a question, can this be done by the usual Access developer? And then you throw in that tool, yeah, which is great.
Yeah.
And another question from myself, do you see any role for the Access team in this subject? Would it help if they would, for example, support a kind of hosting with some documentation or demo or something? That's what I always want to suggest to the Access team. Yeah. So they could say we can deliver Access remotely on the web somehow, but because there's nothing Access specific.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, I've always thought that one should be able to go to the Azure Marketplace and pick a VM that already has everything configured, ready to host an Access application. So all of the steps that I showed in terms of configuring the server is really, for somebody doing it for the first time, a nightmare. You know, if you do it multiple times, it seems intuitive, but for the first time, it's just hard to even find what options you're supposed to click and choose. And all of those things really could be done and packaged together into a virtual machine that could be easily replicated. I mean, and that's what we do internally. We don't do it each time. Once we get the VM set up, then we can just copy the VM over and over again. But it's not something we can like share with other people because it has specific license keys and things like that that are tied to our organization. But that should be something that could be a baseline that would make it very easy on, I mean, I think the Microsoft community, the Access community, and even the Access team would benefit by having a virtualized Access remote desktop VM ready to go.
You think so or not?
I think there would be a good market for that. I mean, I think that would be helpful, you know, because it solves that problem, and then I could just easily deploy my application in there. Now, in an Azure environment or cloud environment where I may put this application, it may not work for all Access applications because a lot of Access applications may need to connect to things inside my organization. right? But we have lots of clients where they're deploying things maybe for certain clients of theirs or certain sets of users where the database can be sitting independently for each set of users, and they can update it in another way and can stay completely outside of their organization.
Yeah, so I think we're done. You were exactly in time. Thank you, Luke.
You're very welcome, Carl. Thank you.